I'm Annie Laurie Gaylor.
And I'm Dan Barker. We're co-presidents of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Our guest today is Michelle Dowd, author of the book Forager, Field Notes for Surviving a Family Cult.
The Freedom from Religion Foundation, which produces Freethought Matters, is the nation's largest association of free thinkers. That's atheists, agnostics, and other non-believers. We invite you to join us in our vital work to keep our secular government free from religious influence. Become a member at ffrf.org or ask for a complimentary copy of our newspaper, Freethought Today. Freedom depends on freethinkers. Watch prior episodes of Freethought Matters on FFRF's YouTube channel.
What's it like to grow up in an extremist family cult? Our guest today, Michelle Dowd, is a journalism professor at Chaffey College in Southern California. She's a contributor to the New York Times, the Los Angeles Book Review, and other national publications. She's been nominated twice for the Pushcart Prize and profiled on the second season of Sincerely X, a TED production. Her popular modern love column in the New York Times is what led to the publication of her new book, a memoir, Forager, Field Notes on Surviving a Family Cult.
Michelle Dowd was raised on an isolated mountain in the Angeles National Forest as a member of a family cult where she learned wilderness survival for the coming apocalypse preached by her grandfather. She learned how to identify flora and fauna, navigate by the stars, and forage for edible plants. And she also learned to think for herself and got out of the cult. Thank you for being with us today, Michelle.
Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to see you, Dan and Annie Laurie.
So I really enjoy your book, Forager, and I like how you laid it out. Not only do you tell your story, but you begin each chapter with a field note that describes a particular plant or a tree on the mountain and the usefulness for survival. So how did you come up with that idea of starting with a field note for each chapter?
Well, when I was thinking about how to frame the particular narrative of a very complicated childhood, I was thinking about where I received sustenance and what worked as a foil, what worked in opposition to religion and to the hierarchical system that religion requires, which is that we deny the body and that we privilege some sort of mystery, which is defined by other people. Their definition of creating God in our own image, which is not, by the way, a very female image. So nature worked in my own life as direct contrast to the religious upbringing I was receiving, and in my opinion was the thing that gave me the most courage to leave and try a different life for myself.
Well, a fascinating book. Sometimes it was kind of hard to read about what you went through. A young girl growing up under such harsh circumstances. And I noticed as the book proceeded, your voice, it sounded like I was reading a young girl at the beginning, and then you kind of grew out of that. So can you explain for our viewers, what was this cult, the family cult? What were its beliefs? How were you raised? And what was this whole cult all about?
Well, thanks for such insightful questions, Dan. The cult was created long before I was born. My grandfather began it in 1931. It was an all-male organization for decades. Until my mother was growing up, and she was the fourth child, the first girl. She spent all her time with the boys in an all-male organization. And then my grandfather presumably didn't want to lose her, and so he decided to allow some women or girls to be raised to basically become the brides of the men who were in the organization. Prior to my mom, no one married at the organization. Everyone was required to be celibate for life and to prepare for the apocalypse without a family. Once my mom married one of my grandfather's boys, my father, there became the reality that they were going to have to do something with these children. And so I was the second in our biological family. I was the fourth child born at the fields. So I was very early on in this experiment of what you do when you have communal living and you have young children involved, especially girls. The first 4 children born were all girls. So I was born in a family, an extended family of people who did not like women, and yet here we were, born female in a very masculine world. Short version of, I guess, what the field was like is that my grandfather was the ruler, and he decided what God said, and he determined the interpretation, not just of the Bible, but on any given day, what anyone was allowed to do and not to do. He decided how money was spent. We were given these little pieces of paper called script. And so you didn't actually use real money. You would just give little pieces of paper and things were exchanged within the system of the fields.
But he was teaching that the world was going to end, and you grow up with this idea that any minute you might have to survive what, the apocalypse or the devil, or go out in the wilderness. Is that why you lived on a mountain all those years?
All of that and more. My grandfather, I think, initially leased the property from the government for, I believe, $1 a year in the 1940s. So post-Depression, there were the Public Works program, the WPA, built little mess halls and things on the mountain. There's 700,000 acres of national forest that were available. All of it was not available for camps, but some of it was available. And so my grandfather leased it for a very small amount of money and then didn't do anything with the property, just held it, which is really kind of an intelligent move when you think about it. And so he created the field down in the suburbs between Arcadia and El Monte. And he thought he was going to develop a school and a retreat center and the ability to build an army on the mountain. The truth is he wasn't very comfortable in the wilderness. So we went up there in the late 1970s with our mother, who was comfortable in the wilderness. And so she raised us to learn the land in a way that her father couldn't.
Because you thought the world was going to end? Is that the deal?
Well, yeah, I mean, the deal, I guess, I was a child and I was taught that it was going to end in 1977. So we were prepared for it to end immediately when we got to the mountain. And of course, spoiler alert, that didn't happen. We were taught that we would have to defend ourselves and that we wouldn't have access to civilization. And so we would need to be able to rely on the resources that nature provided.
So you, in the book, I can tell that even though your mother was a conflicted, contradictory person, you really loved your mother. She was the daughter, of course, of the prophet. And you described that she wasn't a typically warm mother, because, she and your grandfather believed that they might have to sacrifice their children. Is that true?
It is true. And my brother said to me recently, Michelle, it's not that they would sacrifice us, they did sacrifice us, in the sense that our mother really truly believed it was not her job to feed or clothe us. It was her job to do what God willed. And her father told her that. And then sometimes I think our mother had a little bit of a different definition than her father, but she pretended to obey him. Mothering was not something that she considered relevant in her life. And I will say she died last year in 2022, and she, even at her death, the organization wrote an obituary and did not include that she had children or grandchildren or a great-grandchild. She was not considered a mother. It was just not part of her identity. And she gave her children to this organization, believing that God would take care of us like he clothes the lilies of the fields. She just did not consider it her responsibility. It's hard to really describe that. Being warm was not her personality, but she also just didn't consider mothering. She considered giving birth her responsibility, but after that, she handed us off when we were a day or two old.
But your mother did teach you the survival skills because she thought the world was, going to end and you'd need them?
I think my mother was learning to survive herself. She did teach us, but she was teaching other people, and we learned by proxy. Our mother didn't sit down and say, so here's what we're about to learn. She just put us in situations to learn those things. She learned them herself. Sometimes she would hand us, like a yucca flower or larva inside the yucca flower, or, teach us to do the pine nuts. But she was always teaching in a wider context of this is how you will lead the world when the trumpet sounds. And she said that she would probably be taken up to heaven, but she didn't know. And so we had to be prepared in case we were left behind to run the army of God. And they use the Revelations, the book of Revelations in the Bible. There's so much symbolism in that, and it can be interpreted a lot of different ways. And so we were often taught in terms of symbols and, when the blood rises to the horses' bridles. And so we were taught honestly to swim in blood. I mean, we were sent to a lake to learn to swim, but we were told we wouldn't be able to take off our shoes, or, we wouldn't necessarily be able to prepare in any given way, and we wouldn't want to lose any resources we had. And so we should just learn to endure whatever it is that we were faced with. And we were intentionally given a lot of very difficult circumstances to overcome as children.
So yes. You must have grown up very frightened. Was the world a frightening place?
Yes, I was much more frightened of the world outside of us than I was of the mountain. I don't think I was very frightened. I mean, it's physically uncomfortable to have to endure cold and endure heat and endure hunger and thirst. But the real fear was that we were going to be outside of the will of God or the eye of God, the love of God. And we were just really taught that that was the light. It was kind of like the sun, that we were taught like God is shining on you and he is providing in this moment. And at any moment, he could just take that from you. He could snap the spider's web and you will fall into eternity and there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So there was a lot of emphasis on how awful hell was going to be and how hell could come to earth. And that was extremely frightening, yes.
And of course, the New Testament is full of that. In your Modern Love piece that ran in the New York Times, and this is the column that led to your book, you write, our parents were often away for long periods of time, and they never used the word love. But the mountain was fruitful and abiding. I knew how to survive on what I found there. So was that the upside to your childhood?
That was absolutely the upside. That's so beautiful the way you read that, Annie Laurie. I think that is also because of sentences like that. That's why I chose the plants as the beginning of each chapter to not only root us in the sense of place, but to also show that that is what was giving me nurturing. And I do think that living on the mountain was the air that I breathed. And without it, I don't think there would have felt like there was any hope for me personally. The mountain was much more of a mother to me than any woman in my life or any parent. We didn't have nurturing. And I found that the earth itself is nurturing. And I still feel that to this day. I feel very comforted when I am around trees or walking barefoot on the earth or eating from something that I'm picking straight from the earth as opposed to something that's been processed. And that is a gift. I do believe it's a gift. And I'm grateful that I at least had that experience on the mountain.
You write that your mom would sometimes just drop you kids off somewhere in the desert or in the mountain and just leave you out on your own with no water and food. You just figure out how to survive. And you did. And in here you give all these survival. I think this is kind of a dangerous book, Michelle, because now that I've read it, I could imagine maybe I could do what you did with the different plants and this. And I didn't realize you could strip off bark of a tree and eat the inside of it. I didn't know that. Can you do that? Yeah.
Might make you a little sick because you're not used to it. But Dan, you could absolutely survive in the wilderness. You would just need a little bit of training. So I would recommend any of our readers receive appropriate training before they go try it. But I think you would be wonderful at it. So you can consider getting the training.
So I want to talk about the sexism, the patriarchal grounding in your book. It just seemed to permeate this cult.
My understanding is it permeates a lot of cults, quite honestly. But I can say that in our particular community, we had more men than women. And that is not true, certainly in all churches. We had far more men than women because it was designed as a male organization. And we were not just second-class citizens. I think we weren't really citizens in the community. We were vehicles for children. We were being raised to have the next generation. And I did not see my body as a temple of God the way that I think some people interpret the Bible as saying that God gave us this body and we should, purify it. What I felt is that it was a burden to be born female and that it was a punishment because Eve ate of the apple and wanted knowledge, and that the worst thing a woman could want was knowledge. And even though I continually wanted knowledge, I felt bad about wanting that knowledge. And that was definitely something that I was punished for, because it was better if we didn't know, right? Like, we were just trained to believe that trusting and obeying were the two key principles of what it meant to be a woman.
Well, we're still hearing that a lot today, so we have to take a break. We're talking with Michelle Dowd, author of the new book, Forager, Field Notes on Surviving a Family Cult. And when we come back, we're going to ask you, Michelle, to tell us exactly why you were excommunicated and what advice you might have for people stuck in a religious cult.
Hi, I'm Ron Reagan, an unabashed atheist.
When I first recorded that commercial back in 2014, being openly atheist in America was still fairly uncommon. Today, the fastest growing religious group in the country is the non-religious, especially among the young. That progress is heartening, but the religious pushback is fierce and the forces of Christian nationalism are well organized. Our progress won't continue unless we work together so that reason and our secular constitution will prevail. That's why I'm asking you to join the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest and most effective association of atheists and agnostics working to keep state and church separate, just like our founders intended. Please join the Freedom from Religion Foundation today. Ron Reagan, lifelong atheist, not afraid of burning in hell.
I believe in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute, where no religious body seeks to impose its will, directly or indirectly, upon the general populace.
Let's restore respect for America's secular roots. Help the Freedom from Religion Foundation defend the wall of separation between state and church. Join us at ffrf.org. Freedom depends on freethinkers.
And welcome back to Freethought Matters. We're continuing our conversation with Michelle Dowd, author of the compelling new memoir, Forager, Field Notes on Surviving a Family Cult. So Michelle, in your book you say that the love of the God that you believed in was not a warm love. You say it was more like a chemical burn. Why do you say that?
I was not raised to think of God's love as tender or nurturing, but instead as fire. And not the kind of fire, as I said, that warms you, the kind of fire that burns you. And I think that it was a combination of a very rough Old Testament God and a very predictive New Testament God that was just displeased with the creation of humanity and really wanted to destroy it because we did not live up to God's expectations for what humanity would be. That's, again, I'm not sticking up for any of these belief systems. I'm just relating them as I understood them.
Well, that is what the Bible says, though, what you're describing. So.
Yes, I mean, in many passages, and it's certainly interpreted as such. Now, Jesus also, if you're looking just at Jesus's words, he offered a very different version, I think, sometimes of God, but that's not the one that we followed at our particular organization. And I will also say that my grandfather led this organization for so many years that my understanding is that during the earlier years, he was more compassionate than he was by the time he was an old man when I came along. So I think that he was particularly harsh as a cult leader during the last decade of his life, which just so happened to coincide with me coming of age. And it was a particularly rough time to exist within our particular cult.
Well, and speaking of rough, I understand there was sexual abuse.
Yes, and it was systemic in my case, but I was born there and groomed there from birth. Not everyone experienced that, thank goodness. I have heard lots of stories one way or another. But I felt that I was put in a lot of compromising positions since I was a very, very young child. And a lot of it was just someone looking the other way as opposed to glorifying it. But yes, I was sexually abused from the age of 6.
Wow.
I'm so sorry. When did you first start having doubts about religion?
My earliest memories include doubts about religion.
Really?
Yes. I felt that there was juxtaposition. I wouldn't understand that word, that language. It's hard to even, I feel that my doubts were even pre-verbal. So it's, the language I'm putting on it is very adult language. But even as a child, I understood that the things that they were saying were contradictory. And I knew I wasn't loved. And there is something really damaging about having sexual touch be the only touch you're given at very young ages, because you know that it doesn't feel good, but you also know that you need attention. And it's very disorienting. And I learned, and I think this is common, I learned to dissociate from my body. So I removed myself. I have a lot of memories of looking at myself, like kind of floaty, and being separate. And that certainly came of use when we did go to the mountain. I wasn't born on the mountain. We moved there when I was 7, almost 8. And when we moved to the mountain, it was useful to me that I had already learned to dissociate, because then when you're experiencing hunger or thirst or colds, you are able to see it as something other than you. And it's taken me a very long time to learn to come back into my body. And that is really one of the horrible things that happens to so many girls and boys, you know, anyone who is molested at early ages. It's very difficult sometimes to live in your body.
So you eventually found your way out. Well, you were kicked out, basically. Can you tell us briefly, what was it that caused you to be excommunicated from that family cult?
I think that this was just the last straw that actually got me kicked out. I was being excommunicated in stages prior to that. Things were being taken away from me, privileges in terms of talking to other members of the organization. We had something for the teenagers that they called the court, and you would be judged according to your spirituality, and you would be given a ranking. And so my rankings were already going down. And one of the peers, like someone your age or a year or two older, would sit down with you and tell you all the things wrong with you every single week. And then you would have to account for those things. And they were being told to do that by the leaders, but it was still delivered. And so my sister was the one who was telling me all the bad things about me. And to some degree, she was right. And to the extent that the things that I was doing were not acceptable in that particular organization, which is asking questions. Because I had been separate from the organization while I was hospitalized, which is in the book, so I can't summarize it all right now, but you can read the book and I'll tell you about it. By the time I was 16, I felt that it was easier to go along with the system, but it felt more true and honest and courageous to me to think about who the system was hurting. And I don't even know that I thought it was hurting me at the time, because I wasn't very in touch with that. But I did see how it was hurting my brother. I did see how it was hurting other, kids who were younger than me. I saw people who had been excommunicated, and they had been very, very close to me, and I was never allowed to speak to them again. So I saw that that was a breaking. So I went with a quitter, someone who had been raised with me who had quit, and that's the word that we used at the time. And he went to college, and we ran into each other accidentally, and he invited me to a movie. And because I was already so separate from the organization, I think emotionally and philosophically, I accepted this invitation,
and
knowing that it was
never been to a movie, right?
correct. And I went with him, and I went to a restaurant, and the movie was rated R. So I did so many bad things. I went out with a boy. I went in a boy's car. I sat in a theater. I watched a rated R movie. I didn't drink. We had Diet Coke, but I did commit many sins by their standards. And when I told my sister, I knew that it was over, that there was no way that anyone would forgive me for those things. I think I sort of caused my own downfall because I didn't know how to walk away. So I set things in motion that caused that. Now, I was still a minor, and I was just sort of taken up to the mountain at that point and left alone. Eventually, I found my way to college, but it didn't take me too long after that. I went to college about a little over a year later.
So, and that's an interesting story. You said you had only applied at one school, but they sent your application to Pitzer College. and they offered you a 4-year scholarship. Is that right?
Yes, I was very fortunate to receive an acceptance letter from Pitzer before I applied. So when they sent me the acceptance letter, I did have to go through some paperwork, of course, to get into the school. But when I was there, I gave a speech there last night, and we were going through the memories of all that. They were very, at the time, extremely counterculture, and they really welcomed someone who had a very untraditional background. And they loved that I was curious and ready to learn. And to be honest, I was ready to learn, and I dived like really deeply into academia from, I want to say the moment I got there, but before I got there. They sent me a book, Empire of the Sun, to read before I even entered college. And I just read that like so deeply, and I marked it all up the way I had done the Bible. And my education really saved me. It was a really, really wonderful experience to be able to learn in a safe environment.
So in about a minute, Michelle, do you have any advice for people, especially women stuck in a religious cult, or the people who love them who are trying to get them out?
I think those are two very different things, because the people who love people who are stuck in cults unfortunately don't have very much power, because the people who are in the cults often, A, don't believe they're in a cult, and B, are very brainwashed into feeling that this is the only place that they matter and the only place they belong. If you're inside of an organization and you don't know how to get out, the first step is acknowledging that you want to. And quite honestly, it can take a long time to get to the point that you know that you want to leave, because at the beginning it feels benevolent, and then it gets hotter and hotter and gets to the point you don't feel that you could survive. So knowing that you want to is the first step. And then I would encourage, since we have the internet now, I have been listening to Dr. Steve Hassan, who is a cult expert. He's wonderful. He was a former Moonie, and he went through deprogramming, and he will talk people through what they need to do to have free thinking and to be able to get the resources they need to survive outside of the system.
And then we would also recommend that people read your book. Michelle.
Thank you.
So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. And I'll mention too that the book is on Audible. So if anybody wants to listen to it instead of read it, that's available too.
Forager, Field Notes on Surviving a Family Cult. Thank you for watching Freethought Matters.
Because free thought matters.
Hi, I'm Steve Pinker. In my book, Enlightenment Now, I show that the world has become a better place as reason has been overcoming superstition and tribalism. But the values of the Enlightenment are under attack. That's why I'm a proud member of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest association of free thinkers working to keep state and church separate. Please join me in supporting the Freedom from Religion Foundation to ensure that our government is driven not by religion, but by reason.